The writings of Flavius Josephus have always proven to be a very great treasury of knowledge for New Testament scholars seeking a more accurate understanding of the Jewish and Roman worlds in the time of Jesus. Josephus was a Jewish Pharisee who took up arms in the war between Judea and Rome in 66 to 70 CE. In fact, Josephus Bar Matthias, to use his full name, became a commanding general operating in Galilee. Eventually, he had to recognize the futility of his efforts. There was simply no way his haggard men, shrieking in numbers, could defeat the Roman juggernaut. So he switched sides and declared his loyalty to the Roman general Vespasian, even declaring him the prophesied Messiah of Israel. Nor was he alone in this affirmation. Even the great Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai made the same declaration. Understandably, Jews have always cursed Josephus as the worst of turncoats and traitors. For this reason, Jews made no effort to copy and preserve his writings. That job fell to Christians. But it is important to realize that Josephus, having earned the gratitude of Rome, even becoming a member of the imperial Flavian regime with the added surname Flavius, employed his leisure to write his voluminous works, Wars of the Jews, or the Jewish War, Antiquities of the Jews, or Jewish Antiquities, and the Life of Flavius Josephus. His goal was to vindicate the honor of his nation and its noble heritage. In his books, he emphatically insisted that Jews were by and large not anti-Roman, but that small factions of fanatical terrorists were to blame for initiating the hostilities against Rome. This was not mere spin. Romans were in general favorable to Jews and Judaism, even exempting Jews from military service and from having to sacrifice incense to Caesar. Instead, Jews simply offered prayer and sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple on Caesar's behalf. In fact, the Jewish war was ignited when zealot revolutionaries put the priest to the sword and suspended the sacrifices. It is ironic that Josephus is written off as a traitor when he was so much like the prophet Jeremiah, who centuries earlier had stirred the wrath of fellow Jews by warning them that God would not protect them from the impending invasion by the Babylonian Empire. The nation's own sins, he preached, had caused them to forfeit divine protection. Not exactly Mr. Popular, Jeremiah was seized by a patriotic mob and dumped down a dry well. Who knows whether Josephus was another Jeremiah? The only real difference was that Josephus did not indict the entire Jewish nation, but only a small element of wild-eyed troublemakers. Christians have always been sure that Josephus, who composed his works towards the close of the 1st century CE, must have had something to say about his near contemporary Jesus of Nazareth. But did he? We find in his Antiquities a brief paragraph, the Testimonium Flavianum, that reads as follows. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, and when upon accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them spending a 3rd day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. But critical scholars have long considered this snippet a Christian interpolation. It seemed absurd for the Jew Josephus to say of Jesus, he was the Christ. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the early 3rd century CE, had access to earlier manuscripts of Josephus than we do today, and what he read there led him to say that one thing was for sure, Josephus did not think Jesus was the Messiah. The 4th century church historian Eusebius is the first known ancient writer to quote the Testimonium, and while most scholars contend that the Christian-sounding lines of the text were indeed Christian additions, Josephus wrote the rest, providing us with at least one ancient historian to verify the historical existence of Jesus. But this procedure is itself a case of spin doctoring, trying to salvage as much of the text as possible for reasons of Christian apologetics. To others, it seems more likely that Eusebius fabricated the whole thing. The text looks tailor-made to support the argument Eusebius is making when he quotes the passage. He was not above such shenanigans, as it was also probably he who fabricated a patently spurious exchange of letters between Jesus and King Abgarus of Edessa, which, with fingers crossed, he said he discovered in the royal archives of Edessa. Christian apologists have traditionally dated the New Testament Gospels as early as possible in order to claim they are based on accurate eyewitness testimony. They like to place Mark around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke some 10 years later, and John between 90 and 100. But what if they are all very late 1st century or even mid-2nd century? A growing number of scholars believe they are, and this opens the possibility that these Gospels have borrowed material from Josephus. The very idea has until recently been something of a scholarly heresy, but nowadays it is becoming clear that it is not a question of whether Josephus referred back to Jesus, but rather whether the New Testament writers borrowed from Josephus. Let's survey a handful of Gospel passages that appear rather strongly to echo the works of Josephus. First, the nativity story of Jesus in broad outline reminds us of the birth story of Moses, in a time of terrible persecution of Hebrew sojourners in ancient Egypt. Pharaoh grows apprehensive about the rapid increase in the Hebrew population within his borders, and in order to head off any danger from that quarter, initiates a genocidal pogrom among the Hebrews residing in Egypt, ordering the killing of all Hebrew male newborns. Voila! No more 5th column to worry about. In Matthew, King Herod learns from visiting astrologers that a new king of the Jews has been born. News that frightens Herod, who suspects someone is plotting to depose and to replace him. He orders his troops to slaughter all the baby boys in the prophesied birthplace, Bethlehem. But Josephus' retelling of the Exodus text has one important detail not found in Exodus. As in Matthew's nativity story of Jesus, Pharaoh consults his staff of scripture scholars about the matter, and they tell him he must eliminate one particular baby boy. Herod's scribes are able to pinpoint the town where the Messiah must be born, Bethlehem, but not the exact address. Not knowing which Bethlehem baby is the dangerous one, he decides to have them all killed. Herod is gunning for one particular infant, the newborn king of the Jews. In Exodus, there was no one target. Mass genocide was the goal from the start. This means that Matthew seems to have supplemented Exodus with Josephus to enrich the story as well as to render it more Christocentric. One of those sacred scribes, who are very sagacious in foretelling future events truly, told the king that about this time there would be a child born to the Israelites, who, if he were reared, would bring the Egyptian dominion low and would raise the Israelites, that he would excel all men in virtue and obtain a glory that would be remembered through all ages. Which thing was so feared by the king that according to this man's opinion, he commanded that they should cast every male child which was born to the Israelites into the river, and destroy it. That besides this, the Egyptian midwife should watch the labors of the Hebrew women, and observe what is born, for those were the women who were enjoined to do the office of midwives to them, and by reason of their relation to the king would not transgress his commands. He enjoined also that if any parents should disobey him and venture to save their male children alive, they and their families should be destroyed. A man whose name was Amram, one of the nobler sort of the Hebrews, was afraid for his whole nation, lest it should fail by the want of young men to be brought up hereafter, and was very uneasy at it. His wife being then with child, and he knew not what to do, hereupon he betook himself to prayer to God, and entreated him to have compassion on those men who had no wise transgressed the laws of his worship, and to afford them deliverance from the miseries they at that time endured, and to render abortive their enemies' hopes of the destruction of their nation. Accordingly, God had mercy on him, and was moved by his supplication. He stood by him in his sleep, and exhorted him not to despair of his future favors. Know therefore that I shall provide for you all in common what is for your good, and particularly for thyself what shall make thee famous. For that child, out of the dread of whose nativity the Egyptians have doomed the Israelite children to destruction, shall be this child of thine, and shall be concealed from those who watch to destroy him. And when he is brought up in a surprising way, he shall deliver the Hebrew nation from the distress they are under from the Egyptians. When the vision had informed him of these things, Amram awaked and told it to Jochebed, who was his wife.
Jochebed, I had a dream. A terrible dream.
And now the fear increased upon them on account of the prediction in Amram's dream, for they were under concern, not only for the child, but on account of the great happiness that was to come to him also. Luke's gospel contains the famous scene of the adolescent Jesus sitting in the Jerusalem temple, exchanging scriptural interpretations with the venerable elders. He is a mere 12 years of age, and he is already wiser than they are. We are reminded of Josephus' own boast about his childhood precocity and dialectical skill. I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning, and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. Moreover, when I was a child, about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together, in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law. Has Luke simply retold the story in Josephus, and retold it starring young Jesus? It's very possible. But it's not just the writings of Josephus that furnish the prototypes for the gospel stories of Jesus. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, tells the story of a half-witted street person named Carabbas, a name quite similar to the Barabbas of the gospel story. Though Carabbas does resemble Barabbas, the man himself is a stand-in for Jesus, who is mocked and dressed in fake finery as a mock king. There was a certain madman named Carabbas, afflicted not with a wild, savage, and dangerous madness, for that comes on in fits without being expected either by the patient or by bystanders, but with an intermittent and more gentle kind. This man spent all his days and nights naked in the roads, minding neither cold nor heat, the sport of idle children and wanton youths, and they driving the poor wretch as far as the public gymnasium and setting him up there on high that he might be seen by everybody, flattened out a leaf of papyrus and put it on his head instead of a diadem, and clothed the rest of his body with a common doormat instead of a cloak. And instead of a scepter, they put in his hand a small stick of the native papyrus, which they found lying by the wayside and gave to him. And when, like actors in theatrical spectacles, he had received all the insignia of royal authority, and had been dressed and adorned like a king, the young men bearing sticks on their shoulders stood on each side of him, instead of spear-bearers, in imitation of the bodyguards of the king. And then others came up, some as if to salute him, and others making as though they wished to plead their causes before him, and others pretending to wish to consult with him about the affairs of the state. Then from the multitude of those who were standing around there arose a wonderful shout of men calling out Maris. And this is the name by which it is said that they call the kings among the Syrians. For they knew that Agrippa was by birth a Syrian, and also that he was possessed by a great district of Syria, of which he was the sovereign. This, it seems, is way too close for comfort, too close to be coincidence. One must suspect that someone has simply rewritten and repurposed the Carabbas story for Jesus. Josephus relates a sad and grotesque incident from the aftermath of the Roman victory over the Jewish rebels. And when I was sent by Titus Caesar with Cyrillans and 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Thecoa, in order to know whether it were a place fit for a camp, as I came back, I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them, in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered. Doesn't this scene bring to mind the gospel passion narratives where Jesus is crucified between 2 other convicted listae, brigands, rebels? Joseph of Arimathea approaches the Roman Pilate to beg the body of Jesus in order to give it a decent burial. Pilate readily grants the request just as Titus does. But what about the other 2 crucified men? In Josephus, all 3 are taken down alive, but 2 are too far gone and soon expire, while 1 makes it. Mark loses interest in the 2 men crucified alongside Jesus. He has no further use for them in this narrative, so they drop out. It looks as if Mark borrowed the basic premise from Josephus. Note, too, that Flavius Josephus was also called Joseph bar Matthias, which is strikingly close to Joseph of Arimathea. Again, it is probably no mere coincidence, but the parallel material that chiefly concerns us here is Josephus' account of one Jesus ben Ananias. One Jeshua, son of Ananias, a very ordinary yokel, came to the feast at which every Jew is supposed to set up a tabernacle for God. As he stood in the temple, he suddenly began to shout, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the 4 winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against bridegrooms and brides, a voice against the whole people." Day and night he uttered this cry as he went through all the streets. Some of the more prominent citizens were very annoyed at these ominous words, laid hold of the fellow and beat him savagely, without saying a word in his own defense or for the private information of his persecutors. He persisted in shouting the same words as before. The Jewish authorities rightly concluded that some supernatural force was responsible for the man's behavior, took him before the Roman procurator. There, though scourged till his flesh hung in ribbons, he neither begged for mercy nor shed a tear, but lowering his voice to the most mournful of tones, answered every blow with, "Woe to Jerusalem." When Albinus, for that was the procurator's name, demanded to know who he was, where he came from, and why he uttered such cries, he made no reply, whatever to the questions, but endlessly repeated his lament over the city, till Albinus decided he was a madman and released him. And up until the time the war began, he never approached any of the citizens, nor was he observed speaking to any of them. But day after day, as though it were a prayer he had carefully composed, he evoked his lament, "Woe to Jerusalem." He neither cursed those who beat him every day, nor did he bless those who offered him food. To everyone he gave the same reply, the melancholy omen in his lamentation. His cries were most vociferous during the feast days. So he continued wailing for 7 years and 5 months until he saw his prediction fulfilled in the siege of the city. Then he found peace. You see, as he was making his rounds and shouting in a piercing voice from the wall of the city, "Woe again to the city, and to the people, and to the temple," to which he added a final word, "and woe to me too." A stone hurled by a catapult struck and killed him instantly. And so, with those ominous predictions still on his lips, he died. Now let's take it piece by piece. First, Josephus places Jesus ben Ananias at the yearly Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkoth. The Gospel Jesus, particularly in the Gospel of John, also makes a practice of attending the Jerusalem feasts and using them as occasions to preach to the gathered throngs, as in John 2:13, 23, 5:16, 4, 7:2, 37 through 39, 10:22, 12:12, and 13:1. Like Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus ben Ananias took his stand at the festivals and shouted his message. By itself, this might seem insignificant, but it is just a running start. His doomsaying rant contains a warning for bridegrooms and brides, who will soon be overwhelmed along with the whole people. One is reminded of the similar words ascribed to Jesus in Luke 17:26-27. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married, they were given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. The Jewish authorities, meaning the officers of the Jewish Sanhedrin, arrested Jesus ben Ananias and marched him over to the stand before the Roman procurator Albinus, just as their predecessor seized Jesus of Nazareth and hauled him before Pilate. Jesus ben Ananias' accusers thought him demon-possessed, just as the opponents of the Nazarene did in John 8:48. Like the Gospel Jesus, Mark 15:3-5, Matthew 27:62-63, Luke 23:9, and John 19:1 and 9, the son of Ananias bore the terrible floggings with similar stoic impassivity, neither offering any defense nor pleading for clemency. Theodore J. Whedon, the scholar who studied the parallels more closely than anyone else, stressed as particularly important the questions of Albinus to his Jesus. Just who are you? Where are you from? In John's Gospel 19:9, Pilate asks the same of Jesus. Whedon also noted the incongruity of Pilate having Jesus whipped, but then recalling him for another round of questioning. It would seem more natural, as in Matthew 27:26, for Pilate to have Jesus flogged as the penultimate stage before crucifixion. So why the difference? Whedon proposed that John was working from a passion narrative like Matthew's, but then appended a version of the Josephus narrative according to which the flogging preceded the procurator's questions to the prisoner. He did this in order to provide a jumping-off point for Pilate to raise the question of Jesus' otherworldly origin. My kingdom is not from this world. The same question of Jesus' ultimate origin is raised elsewhere in John at 6:42 and 7:27-28. 7 years after this, during the Roman siege of Jerusalem, Jesus ben Ananias was to be seen walking back and forth along the rim of the city wall, once again crying out, "Woe, woe, woe," like a broken record. But a period was placed at the end of the tiresome sentence when the old fanatic was squashed by a huge rock fired from a Roman catapult. His last words, we are told, were, "And woe to me too." Even here we must suspect more gospel borrowing. Did this scene possibly inspire the quotation in Luke 20:17-18 from Psalm 118:22 through 23. The very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Combined with Isaiah 8:14 through 15. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but when it falls on any one, it will crush him. We have already seen that the Gospel writers utilized other ancient sources besides the works of Josephus. Like Philo's against Flaccus, it would be no difficult task to compile a whole parallel gospel narrative by simply substituting the familiar canonical passages one by one with parallel stories from other Jewish and Hellenistic tales, which may in fact have been the originals borrowed and recast by the New Testament writers. But that's an exercise for another day.